The Vietnam War was a collision of eras. Up in the clean blue, it looked like the future. Sleek jets slicing the sky, rotor blades beating the air into submission, radios chattering in clipped code that sounded like certainty. But beneath that emerald roof of jungle, the war belonged to older things: mud and leeches, sharpened bamboo, the slow patience of men who could disappear into green shadows and wait all day for one mistake. In Phuoc Tuy Province, the canopy was so thick it felt like a ceiling. From above, it was beautiful, an endless living carpet rippling with heat and rain. From below, it was a trap. You could stand 10 feet from another man and never see him. Sound traveled in strange ways. The jungle amplified some noises and swallowed others, like it was choosing what deserved to be heard. The Americans owned the sky, or at least they told themselves they did. But the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong had learned how to turn that sky into a net of death. They built hidden positions along ridges and clearings, hauled heavy weapons where they shouldn't be able to haul them, and waited. They didn't need to beat American aircraft in the open. They just had to force them low and slow for a moment. That was enough. It happened on a humid afternoon when the horizon was hazy and the air smelled like distant rain. The strike mission had started like 100 others, routine in the way war becomes routine when you do it long enough. A flight of American aircraft moved toward their target, working through radio calls and navigation checks like men going through a familiar prayer. The pilot, Lieutenant Daniel Miller, mid-20s, lean and quiet in the cockpit, had that strange, practiced calm that comes from trusting machines. He'd been flying long enough to know how thin that trust really was. He never saw the gun that hit him. The burst came up from the tree line, a sudden ugly stitching of 37mm anti-aircraft fire, and then the world in his cockpit became a different world, warning lights blooming red, the aircraft shuddering like it had been punched by a giant. The smell hit him first, hot electrical burn, then fuel, then something metallic and final. His controls went soft in his hands. He heard himself say, almost casually, "I'm hit," as if announcing the weather. Then the left side of the aircraft erupted. Orange flame rolled past the canopy, and the sound, the comforting roar of engines that meant life, changed into a snarling howl that meant death was climbing into the cockpit with him. Training took over. He didn't think about the ground. He didn't think about capture or propaganda videos or the stories he'd heard about pilots being marched through villages. He thought about a sequence of movements burned into his muscles, hands, levers, pull. The ejection seat slammed him into the sky with brutal force, and for a heartbeat, the world was pure violence. Wind tearing at him, his vision tunneling, his body convinced it had been ripped in half. Then it went quiet. Not peaceful quiet, not the quiet of safety. The eerie whistling quiet of a man falling through humid air while his own aircraft burned somewhere behind him. His parachute snapped open with a jolt that stole his breath, and then he saw what waited below, a sea of green, vast, impenetrable, and entirely controlled by an enemy that treated jungle like a hometown. The white parachute above him was a beacon, a confession, a flare that said, "Here, I'm here, come get me." He drifted down, helplessly slow. He could already imagine the eyes turning toward him. He could already feel the net tightening. When his boots hit the jungle floor, the war became intimate. The air was thick, wet, and alive with insects. He landed hard, stumbled, went down into mud that sucked at his boots like hands. His knee screamed with pain. Something had twisted in the fall. He tore free of the chute lines with shaking hands, trying to drag the bright fabric under foliage, trying to hide a thing that felt too clean for this place. He carried almost nothing useful: a sidearm, a small survival kit, a PRC-90 survival radio, his most valuable possession now, a tiny box that could summon an army if he lived long enough to be found. His fingers were clumsy. His hands felt too loud. He pressed the radio and spoke the words that were both salvation and danger. "Mayday, mayday, downed aircraft, pilot alive." Static hissed in reply, then voices snapped back, sharp with urgency. Somewhere far away, air-conditioned command centers lit up with activity. On the ground, the jungle did not care. Every snap of a twig sounded like a rifle shot. Every rustle of leaves felt like movement that didn't belong to him. He limped away from the crash direction, forcing himself to breathe through panic, pushing into thick undergrowth until his lungs burned with wet heat. He knew the rules. They told pilots the rules in survival school, in briefings, in calm rooms far from this kind of fear. Move away from the crash, hide the parachute, stay still once you find cover, talk only when necessary. But knowledge didn't kill adrenaline. Adrenaline turned everything inside him into a drum. He didn't have long. Enemy tracking teams would be moving already, trained men who could read disturbed leaves the way Miller read instrument panels. And then, above the canopy, the American machine responded. It always did. A combat search and rescue package came together with the force of habit. Jolly Green Giant rescue helicopters moving in, escorted by A-1 Sky Raiders and other aircraft ready to suppress anything that fired. The doctrine was clear: overwhelm the area, smother enemy guns, hover over the survivor, hoist him out, leave. It looked impressive in the sky. An armada of metal and noise, blades churning the air, jets circling like hawks. But the enemy had been waiting for this too. To the NVA, a downed pilot was the ultimate bait. Not only a propaganda prize, but a trap that could draw in more aircraft, more targets. Under the canopy, they'd already shifted guns into position. Heavy machine guns and anti-aircraft batteries tucked into reinforced pits. Camouflaged so well while, they looked like jungle until they opened fire. They didn't fire too early. They waited for the rescue birds to commit. When the lead helicopters began their descent, the jungle exploded. Tracer rounds stitched the air. The deep hammering thunder of 37mm flak shook the sky. The sound was so violent it seemed to rearrange the air itself. The rescue pilots tried to maneuver, tried to find angles, tried to hover just long enough, but every time a helicopter slowed, it became a hanging target. Sky Raiders dove low, unleashing rockets and cannon fire, napalm turning patches of hillside into roaring orange. The jungle smoked, leaves curled and blackened, but the enemy positions were too deep, too prepared. The NVA had built a killing box, layers of fire that overlapped, designed to punish anything that tried to hang in one place. The more noise the Americans made, the more they announced the prize. Every village within miles would know. Every patrol would turn toward the sound, and down on the jungle floor, Miller heard it all. The distant roar of engines, the angry chatter of guns, explosions rolling through the green like thunder. For a moment, hope flared. Then fear rose right behind it, because if he could hear the rescue attempt, the enemy could too. He pressed himself into a thicket, breathing through his mouth, trying not to cough, listening to the steady approach of voices that weren't speaking English. The golden hour, the first critical stretch after a pilot goes down, was closing. In the command net above, the mood turned grim. The Americans could keep battering the jungle with air power, but every attempt risked adding more burning wreckage to the story. The rescue armada was a hammer trying to strike a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was alive and it had teeth. A senior controller finally said what everyone was thinking: "We keep doing this, we're going to lose another bird." There was a pause, the kind of pause that happens when doctrine meets reality and reality refuses to bend. Then a voice came across the radio, quieter, unfamiliar to some of the Americans, calm in a way that didn't belong in that chaos. A small patrol, Australian, already on the ground, SAS, 6 men. No demand for air cover, no request for artillery, no desire for a big show. Just a message: they were nearby. They could try. They would move in quietly and bring the pilot out if it was possible. For American commanders raised on mass and muscle, it sounded almost absurd, like sending a matchstick to solve a fire. But the sky had become a trap, and time was draining away like blood. The decision came with reluctant acceptance. Pull back the big birds, halt the noisy incursions, let the phantoms work. As the American aircraft peeled away, the jungle settled into a heavy silence, an unnatural calm after so much noise. Smoke drifted above the canopy. Birds stayed quiet. Somewhere far off, a final boom rolled and faded, and in that silence, the Australian SAS began to move. They were already close, operating in the sector as part of their own quiet war. Reconnaissance, patrols, snatch missions, the kind of work that didn't make headlines and rarely left clean records. Their leader was a veteran with eyes that never seemed to blink too fast. He'd learned jungle in other places, Malaya, Borneo, and Vietnam was simply another book written in the same language. To the SAS, the jungle wasn't an obstacle, it was cover. They didn't run toward the crash smoke. Running was for men who wanted to be heard. They moved with a glacial patience, stepping exactly where the man ahead had stepped, breaking no branches, disturbing no vines. Their gear was taped down, metal buckles were dulled, canteens were secured so they wouldn't clink, breathing stayed shallow and controlled. They communicated without words, fingers, palms, subtle pressure on an arm. The jungle had its own rhythm, bugs, distant water, the occasional crack of bamboo settling. The SAS didn't fight that rhythm, they joined it. To anyone watching, they were not men moving through forest, they were the forest shifting. Within an hour, they began to find signs of NVA trackers, fresh boot prints in soft mud, a snapped twig bent the wrong way, a faint trail where bodies had pushed through brush with more urgency than patience. The enemy was closing in on the parachute beacon like sharks toward blood. Twice, the SAS patrol halted as an NVA search party moved parallel to them, less than 50 meters away. The Australians didn't raise weapons, they didn't fight. That wasn't the mission. Fire would be loud, fire would draw more men, fire would risk the pilot's life. Instead, they went still and let the enemy pass. By late afternoon, the smell of burned jet fuel grew stronger. The ground underfoot was damp and blackened in patches. They found the pilot's parachute, partly stuffed into a hollow log, a desperate attempt at concealment. Amateur work, understandable work. The kind of work a man does when he knows he's being hunted and has no time to think like a hunter. To an NVA tracker, it was a signpost. To the SAS, it was a compass. The patrol leader studied the disturbed area, the direction of dragged fabric, the broken leaves. He knew a downed aviator's instincts. Get away from smoke, find thick cover, maybe crawl toward high ground if possible, wait for the roar of rescue helicopters that might never come. But the NVA were using a beat system, combing in lines, methodically pushing the jungle the way fishermen push a net through water. The Australians had to cross those lines. They timed their movement to the enemy's noise. When the NVA shifted positions, voices rising, equipment clattering, the SAS drifted forward, sound hidden under sound, motion hidden under distraction. Their camouflage paint was so carefully applied, it broke broke their outlines into shadows. Under the teak and bamboo, they looked like darkness that had learned to breathe. At one point, they froze near an enemy rest area. NVA soldiers had stopped for water and cigarettes. Barely 20 meters away, the Australians could smell tobacco, hear the faint metal click of canteens, see shapes through leaves. Mosquitoes landed on SAS faces and drank. No one swatted. For 10 minutes, they remained statues, mud and green paint, muscles locked, eyes steady. This was the difference between soldiers and specialists. Not strength, not bravery in the loud sense, but the ability to master the urge to move when everything inside you is screaming to move. When the NVA moved on, the SAS slipped forward again, entering what they called the red zone. The final few hundred meters where the pilot had to be hiding, because he couldn't keep moving without giving himself away. That's when the patrol leader saw it, a faint metallic glint beneath palm fronds. Not a tripwire, an antenna, a survival radio. The pilot was close and terrified. Terrified men did dangerous things. They ran, they fired at shadows, they gave themselves away with panic. The SAS had to reach him before fear did. Lieutenant Miller lay pressed into damp earth, heart hammering. His revolver was clenched so hard his knuckles looked bleached. 30 yards away, he could hear NVA voices, low and methodical. They were probing the thicket, close enough that Miller could hear equipment shifting, the subtle scrape of boots. He was seconds from the kind of decision men make right before the end. Then the impossible happened. A shadow detached itself from the tree trunk beside him. No sound, no rustle, no warning. A gloved hand clamped gently but firmly over his mouth, stopping the inhale that would have become a shout. Miller's eyes widened in pure animal terror, and then he saw the face inches from his own. Not the face of a captor, but a face painted in disruptive greens and blacks, eyes calm in a way that felt unreal. "Easy, mate," a whisper came, so soft it was almost felt rather than heard. "SAS, you're coming home." For a second, Miller couldn't understand the words. His brain was still stuck in the loop of death. Then the meaning landed, and his whole body sagged with shock. Two more Australians materialized, rifles leveled outward, scanning the jungle as if they could see through it. They didn't look like the soldiers Miller knew. No bulky armor, no heavy helmets. Lean men stripped down to essentials, like predators who had discarded anything that made noise. One trooper handed Miller a sip of water and a glucose strip. He took it with trembling fingers. He didn't realize he was crying until he tasted salt. The patrol leader signaled with a hand. "Can you walk?" Miller nodded, forcing control into his muscles. His knee screamed, but he could move. The leader made another signal, sharp and final. Extraction began. It wasn't a dash. There would be no heroic sprint. Speed was loud. Loud was death. The SAS moved Miller like a fragile object through enemy space, guiding his feet, placing his boots so he wouldn't step on dry sticks, stopping every few meters to listen. Two troopers moved ahead, scouting. Two stayed with the pilot, physically directing him. Two formed rear guard, watching the trail behind them like the jungle itself might open and spill enemies out. They were moving against the flow of the enemy search, and the net was tightening. NVA teams, frustrated by failure, began to press harder. You could hear it in the voices, shorter, sharper. You could hear it in the movement, more careless, more aggressive. At a shallow creek crossing, the mission teetered on a knife edge. An NVA patrol appeared on the opposite bank, nearly platoon strength, moving in a loose line. Close enough that Miller saw faces through leaves, saw a man lift a cigarette, saw the glow for a heartbeat. The SAS leader gave a silent signal, freeze. A hand shoved Miller down into waist-deep mud and rotting vegetation. The water was cold against his bruised leg. He fought the instinct to gasp. For 5 minutes, they stayed submerged and motionless. The NVA passed so close, Miller could smell their tobacco and sweat. A canteen clinked. A boot splashed. Someone laughed softly at a joke the jungle swallowed. Miller's entire body shook with the effort not to move. The SAS didn't shake. They were part of the creek, part of the mud. Their camouflage darkened by water, they vanished. The enemy walked past and never knew. When the jungle quiet returned, the Australians resumed, slow and relentless. To widen their margin, the rear guard began to plant distractions, small delayed charges positioned away from their true path. Minutes later, muffled explosions would pull enemy attention toward the noise, the natural assumption being that the pilot was there, making a break for it. It was deception, not firepower. The kind of trick that made numbers meaningless. Hour by hour, they worked toward the designated green zone, an area far enough from the crash site to allow an aerial pickup without inviting the entire enemy grid to collapse on them again. The sun lowered, turning the light under the canopy strange and dim. The jungle felt tighter at dusk, as if night shrank everything. Then, near the edge of the extraction area, the valley erupted again. The NVA had finally realized they were being played. Their teams began to converge from multiple directions, quickening, driven by the fear of losing the prize. The silence that had protected the SAS for hours could no longer carry them through the last stretch. It was time for a hot extraction. The patrol leader signaled Miller between two troopers as they moved into a small clearing, a rare natural opening where the canopy thinned just enough for a hoist. The distant thump-thump of a helicopter grew louder, beating the air like an approaching storm. For the first time in hours, the SAS leader spoke above a whisper. "Pop smoke!" A canister burst, billowing thick purple smoke that climbed through through the trees like a flag. It also screamed their position to every enemy within earshot. Almost instantly, the tree line flashed with muzzle fire. The SAS answered with discipline, controlled bursts, not panic sprays. They fired to suppress, to buy seconds, to hold the perimeter just long enough. Miller crouched low, trying to make himself smaller than fear. The Huey roared overhead. Door gunners unleashed M60 fire into the foliage, a brutal stream that tore leaves and branches into confetti. The aircraft couldn't land, too tight, too dangerous, so the crew lowered a long steel cable with a stabo rig, swaying under the vibration of the machine. The SAS moved like they'd rehearsed this in nightmares. They clipped Miller into the harness with practiced hands, checking straps, locking him in. Two troopers hooked themselves to secondary lines beside him, human shields with rifles angled down, still firing bursts even as the cable went taut. Miller was yanked upward so hard it felt like his spine left his body. The jungle dropped away beneath him, purple smoke, muzzle flashes, shadows moving between trees. He saw the remaining SAS troopers below, still calm, still working, still holding their ground while waiting for the next lift. For a split second, he saw the patrol leader standing in the clearing like he owned it, rifle steady, posture unhurried in the middle of chaos. Then the canopy swallowed the scene. Green leaves closed over like water closing over a sinking stone. The helicopter banked hard and climbed. Wind tore at Miller's face. The noise of the rotors drowned everything. For the first time since he'd fallen out of the sky, he believed fully, completely, that he might live. When he was finally dragged into the aircraft and the door slammed, the world became vibration and breath and the smell of cordite. Miller lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, shaking so hard he couldn't stop. Someone shouted over the rotor noise, "You're safe." He didn't answer. He couldn't, because safety felt like a concept from another lifetime. Later, hours later, after medical checks and debriefings and coffee that tasted like metal, Miller would try to explain what had happened. The Americans in the room would nod and make notes. They'd talk about tactics and coordination and doctrine. But what stayed with him wasn't the smoke or the gunfire. It was the silence. The way 6 men had moved through enemy territory like ghosts. The way they had turned the jungle from a threat into a cloak. The way they had waited motionless while death walked past within arm's reach. The rescue became a quiet case study, a reminder that overwhelming firepower could be neutralized by terrain and preparation, that a massive machine could still struggle to pluck one man out of a hostile green ocean. And it proved something else, something harder to measure but impossible to ignore. In a place like Vietnam, where the enemy lived inside the landscape, the most powerful weapon wasn't always the bomb or the helicopter or the jet. Sometimes the most powerful weapon was a human being trained to become a shadow. In the years that followed, the lessons of missions like this seeped into how modern special operations forces thought about stealth, patience, tracking, and low signature movement. The jungle had demanded humility from technology, and for one humid afternoon in Phuoc Tuy, 6 Australians had answered with a kind of quiet mastery that felt almost supernatural. Lieutenant Miller survived because the sky tried and failed to muscle him out, and because the jungle, for once, was outmatched by men who knew how to move without being seen. The war above the canopy was loud, but the war that saved him was silent.